Some graves hold the dead. Others quietly protect the living. A cold autumn breeze drifted through the old cemetery just outside Boston as golden leaves floated across rows of weathered headstones. Jonathan Carter stepped slowly along the familiar stone path carrying a bouquet of fresh white lilies, returning to the place he visited every year on the anniversary of the day he lost his only son. At 58 years old, the billionaire had built companies admired around the world, yet no success had ever filled the silence left by an empty chair at family dinners. The cemetery was always peaceful at this hour. No reporters. No business meetings. Only the gentle whisper of the wind and memories that never seemed to grow older. As Jonathan approached the polished granite marker engraved with his son's name, he stopped without taking another step. Someone was already there. A young white waitress, no older than 29, knelt quietly before the grave wearing a simple dark coat over her work clothes, her blonde hair moving softly in the morning breeze. Beside her stood a little white boy about 5 years old holding a small red toy truck with both hands. Tears rolled silently down the woman's face, but she made no effort to wipe them away. The child carefully bent down and placed the little truck against the headstone as though returning something precious to its rightful owner. Then he smiled with innocent warmth and whispered words that stole every breath from Jonathan's chest. "Goodbye, Daddy. I brought your favorite truck again." Jonathan felt the bouquet slip slightly in his hand. His heartbeat echoed louder than the rustling trees surrounding them. The little truck looked remarkably familiar. Years earlier, Jonathan had given an identical toy to his son on his 4th birthday after waiting in line outside a small neighborhood toy store before sunrise. The model had been discontinued decades ago. Very few still existed. The waitress gently rested her hand on the child's shoulder. "Daddy loved you very much," she whispered softly. "Even if he never had the chance to tell you himself." Jonathan remained hidden behind a nearby oak tree, unable to understand what he had just heard. His son had never been married. No one had ever mentioned a child. Every official record after the accident had been painfully simple and painfully final. The woman slowly stood, taking one last look at the grave before helping the little boy button his jacket against the cool wind. As they turned to leave, the child looked back once more and waved happily toward the headstone. Jonathan noticed the boy's bright blue eyes catching the morning sunlight. For one impossible moment, he felt as though he were looking into the eyes of his own son again, and before he could gather the courage to speak, the little boy quietly called the waitress by a name that Jonathan had never heard before. Jonathan remained motionless behind the old oak tree as the woman and the little boy slowly walked toward the cemetery gate. The child skipped across the fallen leaves with innocent energy, stopping every few steps to look back and wave once more at the granite headstone. The woman smiled through quiet tears, gently brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear before taking his small hand again. Jonathan could not explain why he followed them at a respectful distance, keeping far enough away to remain unnoticed. Every question racing through his mind seemed impossible, yet none felt as impossible as ignoring what he had just witnessed. Near the cemetery entrance, the little boy pointed toward a small bakery across the street. "Can we get cinnamon rolls before you go to work, Mommy Emily?" he asked cheerfully. Jonathan silently repeated the name to himself. Emily. It was unfamiliar, yet somehow it lingered in his thoughts. Emily looked down with an apologetic smile. "Only one, buddy. I still have to be at the restaurant before lunch." The boy nodded happily before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a tiny folded drawing. "Can we leave this for Daddy next time?" Emily kissed the top of his head. "Of course. He would love it." Jonathan watched every gentle movement. There was no performance. No attempt to attract attention. Only the quiet routine of two people honoring someone they deeply loved. Several minutes later, Emily and the boy entered the neighborhood bakery while Jonathan remained outside, staring through the window. The little boy laughed as powdered sugar dusted his nose, and for a brief instant Jonathan felt he was watching his own son as a child. The same bright blue eyes. The same habit of tilting his head before smiling. The same curious expression that always appeared before asking another question. His heart tightened with memories he had carefully locked away for years. As Emily paid for breakfast, Jonathan noticed a silver necklace slipping from beneath her scarf. Hanging from it was a simple engraved pendant shaped like a compass. He recognized it immediately. He had given that exact pendant to his son after his college graduation, telling him that wherever life led, he would always find his way home. Only 2 had ever been made. One remained inside Jonathan's personal safe. The other had disappeared after the accident and was never found. Jonathan instinctively touched the bouquet still resting in his hands. The flowers suddenly felt much heavier than before. Emily and the little boy stepped back onto the sidewalk and walked toward a nearby city bus. Just before boarding, the child looked up and asked the question that stopped Jonathan completely. "Mommy, when do you think Grandpa will finally come meet me?" Emily lowered her eyes for a long moment before quietly answering, "Maybe sooner than either of us ever imagined." Jonathan barely remembered the drive back to the Carter estate. The image of the little boy waving at the grave remained fixed in his mind like a memory that refused to fade. By late afternoon he stood inside his late son's study, a room preserved exactly as it had been on the day everything changed. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long golden lines across shelves filled with books, framed awards, and photographs that suddenly seemed incomplete. Jonathan carefully unlocked the antique oak desk where his son had always kept personal journals. He had never opened them before, believing some memories deserved to remain private. Today, silence no longer felt like respect. It felt like surrender. He lifted the first leather-bound journal and slowly turned its pages. Most entries described ordinary moments, business ideas, weekend hikes, and dreams of traveling farther than work had ever allowed. Then one name appeared again and again. Emily. Jonathan stopped breathing for a moment. Every mention carried warmth that no business achievement had ever inspired. One page described meeting a young waitress who laughed because he insisted coffee tasted better in simple ceramic mugs than expensive crystal cups. Another page spoke about long walks through Boston Common, shared cinnamon rolls on rainy mornings, and plans that reached far beyond tomorrow. Jonathan continued reading until he reached an entry dated only 6 months before the accident. Tucked carefully between the pages rested a faded movie ticket and a pressed maple leaf. Beneath them, his son had written a single sentence. "If life is kind, one day our child will laugh at this leaf because I kept something so ordinary." Jonathan slowly closed his eyes. His hands trembled against the worn leather cover. The child at the cemetery had been about 5 years old. The dates aligned with impossible precision. Before he could gather his thoughts, another object slipped quietly from the journal onto the polished wooden floor. It was a small ultrasound photograph folded inside a plain white envelope. Across the top, written in his son's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Our little miracle." Jonathan picked it up carefully, unable to look away. The image had faded with time, yet one detail remained perfectly visible. The examination date matched the very week his son had departed for what became his final business trip. There was no explanation. No farewell. Only hope captured in black and white. Jonathan searched the rest of the envelope, expecting another letter, but instead discovered that several pages had been neatly removed from the journal. Clean edges remained where entire entries had once been. Someone had taken them deliberately. At that moment, the study door opened quietly. Margaret Collins, the Carter family's longtime attorney, stood in the doorway holding an old document box. Her expression changed the instant she saw the ultrasound photograph resting in Jonathan's hands. "I prayed you would never have to find that by yourself," she whispered. Margaret gently placed the old document box on the desk before taking a slow breath. She had served the Carter family for more than 30 years, yet Jonathan had never seen such quiet sorrow in her eyes. She looked toward the journal, the ultrasound photograph, and the empty space where several pages had been carefully removed. "Your son trusted me with something," she said softly. He asked me to deliver these documents if he ever could not return himself. Jonathan slowly opened the weathered box. Inside rested neatly organized folders, several sealed envelopes, and a photograph that immediately caught his attention. It showed his son standing beside Emily beneath brilliant autumn trees in Boston Common. They were smiling without posing, completely unaware that anyone had taken the picture. On the back, his son had written, "The happiest afternoon of my life." Jonathan continued searching through the box until he found another envelope addressed simply to Dad. It had never been opened. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was steady and filled with excitement. "Dad, I finally understand what you always meant when you said success means nothing unless you have someone to share it with. I met someone extraordinary. Her name is Emily. She works hard, laughs easily, and makes ordinary days feel unforgettable. There is something else I cannot wait to tell you in person." Jonathan stopped reading for several seconds, already knowing what those unwritten words must have been. Margaret quietly nodded. "He planned to introduce her to you after returning from that final business trip." Jonathan looked toward the missing pages inside the journal. "Who removed them?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "I do not know. When I received his personal belongings after the accident, several pages were already gone." Jonathan carefully examined the remaining documents. One page listed future plans for a small house near the Charles River. Another contained sketches of a child's bedroom with a red toy truck drawn beside the window. Every page confirmed the same truth. His son had been planning a family, not simply dreaming about one. Then Jonathan unfolded the final sheet inside the box. It was a printed appointment confirmation from a medical clinic scheduled exactly 3 days after his son's final trip. The appointment listed both parents by name. Emily Brooks. Michael Carter. Jonathan whispered his son's name aloud for the first time that day. The room fell completely silent. Margaret reached into the bottom of the box and carefully removed one last item, a sealed envelope stamped with the logo of the company's legal department. "This arrived 1 week after the accident," she said quietly. "Someone instructed our office never to deliver it." Jonathan stared at the untouched seal, realizing that whatever waited inside might finally explain why Emily had spent 5 years mourning alone while a grandfather never even knew his grandson existed. Jonathan carefully broke the company seal that had remained untouched for more than 5 years. The envelope contained only 3 documents, yet together they carried enough weight to reshape everything he believed about his son's final months. The first was a handwritten letter from Michael addressed to the Carter Legal Department. It instructed the company to deliver a second sealed envelope directly to Emily if anything unexpected ever happened to him. The second document was a certified acknowledgement confirming that the envelope had been received. The third was a short internal memorandum stamped with the date 2 days after Michael's funeral. Delivery suspended pending executive review. Jonathan stared at the final sentence until the words blurred before his eyes. "Who ordered this?" he asked quietly. Margaret remained silent for several seconds before answering. The instruction came from someone inside the executive office. The signature was never included. Jonathan slowly lowered the paper. Every clue now pointed toward the same painful conclusion. Emily had never disappeared. She had never chosen silence. Someone had deliberately prevented his son's final wishes from reaching the woman he loved. Margaret gently opened another folder inside the document box. "There is something else you should see." She placed several returned envelopes across the desk. Every one carried Emily's handwriting. Every one was addressed to Michael at the Carter corporate headquarters. Every one had been stamped "Return to sender." Jonathan examined the postmarks one by one. They stretched across nearly a full year. Emily had written after every doctor's appointment, after every milestone in her pregnancy, after the little boy was born, and after his first birthday. None had reached Michael. None had reached Jonathan. Margaret quietly unfolded one of the letters that had never been opened. I only read this after the company released the archives, she whispered apologetically. Jonathan nodded. She read aloud in a trembling voice. Michael, our son smiled today for the very first time. He has your blue eyes and already holds his little red truck every time he sleeps. I hope one day you will see him laugh the way I do every morning. Jonathan closed his eyes. The same red toy truck now rested beside his son's grave every autumn. The same blue eyes had looked back at him beneath the cemetery sunlight. Every small detail he had noticed since that morning had been quietly leading him toward a truth no one intended him to discover. He looked again at the stack of returned letters before noticing one final envelope resting beneath them. Unlike the others, it had never been mailed. Across the front, written in Michael's handwriting, were 5 simple words. Open together when I return. Jonathan carefully lifted the envelope without breaking its seal, realizing that whatever waited inside had been meant for both Michael and Emily, and that the answer to the greatest question of all had remained patiently waiting for someone willing to finally open the past. Jonathan held the sealed envelope for a long time before carefully breaking the aging wax along its edge. The paper inside had been folded with remarkable care, as though Michael believed he would be opening it beside Emily only a few days later. Jonathan unfolded the letter slowly while Margaret remained quietly beside the window, giving him the silence such words deserved. The first sentence immediately tightened his chest. If we are reading this together, then the future we dreamed about has finally begun. Jonathan continued reading through eyes blurred by emotion. Michael wrote about the small house they planned to buy near the Charles River, the nursery with pale blue walls, and the little red truck he had already purchased because he hoped their child would love it as much as he once had. He described introducing Emily to his father during Thanksgiving and imagined teaching his son how to skip stones across the river on warm summer evenings. Every dream had been written with simple confidence, never imagining that life would stop before any of it could happen. Near the bottom of the final page, another folded document slipped gently onto the desk. It was a notarized declaration naming Jonathan as the legal guardian of any future child if both parents were ever unable to provide care. Jonathan stared at the signature beneath his own son's name, unable to speak. Michael had trusted him with a responsibility he had never even known existed. Margaret quietly reached into the envelope and removed one final item, a small memory card sealed inside a transparent sleeve. A handwritten label read, "First Heartbeat." Jonathan inserted the card into the study computer. Moments later, grainy ultrasound footage filled the screen. The room remained completely silent except for the soft rhythmic heartbeat echoing through the speakers. Then Michael's joyful voice broke into quiet laughter behind the camera. "Listen to that," he whispered. "That is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard." Emily laughed softly beside him. "He already knows his grandfather is going to spoil him." Michael answered without hesitation. "Dad will probably buy him every toy truck in Boston." Jonathan covered his face as tears finally escaped. He remembered doing exactly that when Michael was 4 years old, searching half the city for a bright red truck because his son had refused to settle for any other toy. Every clue from the cemetery now fit together with heartbreaking clarity. The truck at the grave. The blue eyes. The compass pendant. The birthday journal. The returned letters. None of them had been coincidences. They had all been quiet echoes of a family that should have existed from the beginning. As the recording ended, another file appeared automatically on the screen. It had never been opened. Its title contained only 6 words that made Jonathan's heart stop once again. For Grandpa. Open on his first visit. Jonathan stared at the unopened file for several moments before moving the cursor across the screen. His hand hesitated above the mouse, not because he feared what he might discover, but because he understood that once he pressed play, there would be no returning to the life he believed he had known. The video opened to a bright spring afternoon inside a small park overlooking the Charles River. Michael sat on a wooden bench beside Emily, smiling into the camera with the relaxed happiness Jonathan had not seen since his son was a teenager. Michael laughed softly before speaking. Dad, if you are watching this, then something unexpected must have happened, because I plan to show you this myself. Jonathan leaned closer to the screen. Michael lifted the little red toy truck into view. You probably remember buying this for me when I was 4. I kept it all these years because it always reminded me that the smallest gifts sometimes become the biggest memories. Emily smiled beside him, resting one hand gently across her stomach. We wanted our child to grow up knowing that family is built by love long before it is measured by time, she said warmly. Michael looked directly into the camera again. Dad, I know you always worried that I worked too much. I finally understand why. The people waiting at home are worth more than every meeting I ever attended. Jonathan felt another wave of emotion rise as his son's familiar smile filled the room once more. Then Michael picked up a folded sheet of paper. If I cannot hand this to you myself, promise me something. Find Emily. Meet our child. Do not let either of them carry this journey alone. The video ended with Michael placing the toy truck on the bench while he laughed at something beyond the camera. The screen faded to black, but Jonathan remained perfectly still. Margaret quietly wiped a tear from her own cheek before breaking the silence. He recorded that 2 days before leaving on his final trip, she whispered. Jonathan slowly closed the laptop and carefully placed every document, every letter, every photograph, and the memory card back inside the leather case. For the first time since the cemetery, uncertainty had disappeared. He no longer needed proof. He needed courage. Early the next morning, he drove through downtown Boston until he found the neighborhood restaurant where Emily worked. Through the front window he saw her serving coffee with the same quiet grace he remembered from the cemetery while the little boy sat at a corner table coloring a picture with bright crayons. Jonathan stepped toward the entrance, then stopped as the child finished his drawing. Across the top of the page, written in careful uneven letters, were 6 simple words that made Jonathan's heart stand completely still. My family is finally coming together. Jonathan stood outside the restaurant for nearly a full minute before opening the door. The small bell above the entrance rang softly, a sound so ordinary that it almost felt impossible that it could mark the beginning of a new life. Emily looked up from the coffee station, her expression changing the moment she recognized him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The restaurant continued around them with quiet conversations, warm lights, and the familiar rhythm of an ordinary morning. Yet for Jonathan and Emily, everything had changed. I know who you are, Jonathan finally said. Emily gently placed the coffee cup in her hand onto the counter. There was no anger in her eyes. Only years of questions waiting for answers. Then you know why I stayed away, she replied softly. Jonathan shook his head. I know why you were kept away. The words carried a different weight. Emily looked down, trying to understand. Jonathan placed the leather case on the table between them and slowly opened it. Inside were the letters, the photograph, the journal pages, and the video file that had finally revealed the truth. Emily covered her mouth as she saw the familiar handwriting. Her hands moved toward the letters with the same care someone might use while touching a precious memory. He kept writing, she whispered. Jonathan nodded. And you kept writing too. For the first time, the distance between them was not filled with unanswered questions. It was filled with proof that both had been waiting for the same moment. A small voice interrupted the silence. Mommy, is this the man from Daddy's pictures? Jonathan turned toward the corner table. The little boy stood holding his drawing with both hands. He had the same bright blue eyes Jonathan had noticed at the cemetery. Emily slowly walked toward him. Yes, sweetheart. This is Jonathan. The boy studied him carefully before asking, Are you my grandpa? The question was simple. Innocent. Completely unaware of the years behind it. Jonathan felt the emotion he had carried for weeks finally reach its destination. He lowered himself to the child's height. I hope I can be, he answered quietly. The boy looked at the small red toy truck beside him and smiled. "Daddy said you would like this." Jonathan gently picked up the toy, recognizing every scratch and every faded mark. It was the same truck he had searched for decades earlier. The same truck Michael had carried through childhood. The same truck that had unknowingly guided him back to his family. Emily watched as Jonathan held the toy with tears in his eyes. Then she reached into her bag and removed one final photograph. It showed Michael holding the little boy as a baby, smiling exactly as Jonathan remembered. On the back were 4 words written by Michael himself. "Waiting for Grandpa's hug." Jonathan looked at Emily, then at the child standing before him, realizing that the greatest moment of his life had not been building an empire. It was finding the family he thought he had lost forever. 1 year later, the small restaurant near the Charles River looked almost exactly the same, yet everything inside had changed. The morning sunlight still entered through the large windows, the coffee machine still filled the room with its familiar sound, and Emily still greeted every customer with the same warm smile she had always carried. But now, every Friday morning, one special guest arrived before the lunch crowd. Jonathan Carter no longer entered as a billionaire searching for answers. He entered as a grandfather carrying a small red toy truck in his hand. The little boy who once stood beside a grave now ran toward him with the excitement of someone who had finally found a place where he belonged. "Grandpa, you brought it again," the child said happily, holding up the matching toy truck he kept beside his favorite books at home. Jonathan smiled as he sat beside him. "Some things are worth bringing back every week." Emily watched from the counter, quietly grateful for a future she once believed would never exist. She never asked Jonathan to replace the years that had been lost. She never expected wealth or recognition. All she wanted was for her son to know his father had loved him, and for her child to know he was surrounded by people who would never leave him behind. Jonathan had learned that lesson too. After discovering the truth, he changed the way he lived. He reduced his business schedule, spent more mornings with his grandson, and created a family foundation dedicated to helping children who grew up separated from important people in their lives. He named it after Michael, not because of how much his son had achieved, but because of how much love his son had carried quietly. Every year on the anniversary of Michael's passing, Jonathan, Emily, and the little boy returned to the cemetery together. They no longer visited a place of sadness. They visited a place where a lost family had found its way back. The red toy truck always rested beside the flowers, a small reminder that even ordinary things can carry extraordinary meaning. On one peaceful autumn morning, the child placed his hand over Jonathan's and looked toward his father's grave. "Do you think Daddy knew we would find each other?" he asked. Jonathan looked at Emily, then at the sunlight moving gently across the grass. He smiled. "I think he hoped we would." As the 3 of them walked away together, the cemetery became quiet again. But this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt complete. Because sometimes the people we lose leave behind more than memories. They leave behind invisible paths that lead us exactly where we were always meant to be. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance is not the fortune we receive, but the family we finally find.